Hello, and I'm Kyle Dyer. Welcome to Colorado Inside Out on this Friday, August 25th. Let's get going with an introduction of this week's panel. George Brauchler, the former DA of the 18th Judicial District in Colorado and current show host on 710 KNUS. Also with us this week, Chris Rourke, managing editor at the Denver Business Journal, as well as Alton Dillard, a communications consultant with his company, the Dillard Group. And then lastly, Adam Burg, vice president of government affairs at the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce. Right off the bat, George, I would like to get your reaction to the news that came out of Boulder on Wednesday of this week that the person responsible for the Boulder King Soopers shootings is able now to stand trial.
Well, we got that news from the district attorney's press release that the state hospital, at CMHIP down in Pueblo, has determined that he's competent to stand trial. I think it's good. I think it's good for the community. I think it's good for the victims. And candidly, it's good for the defendant as well. And that is to get us moving forward into this justice process. Two quick things that people ought to remember. One, sanity is very different than competence. And while many times they sit on top of each other, and in something that my teachers I skipped in math school or in math class called a Venn diagram, they may not be an eclipse, but they're close. And that is, competence is can't appreciate the circumstances of the trial, can't participate in the defense. Insanity is at the time of the crime, didn't know right from wrong, couldn't form the culpable mental state. Now that we've gotten through competence, I expect the defense in this case to pursue whatever avenues they have with the insanity plea.
Okay, thank you very much. Now let's get to what's happened this week. Even though we are more than 14 months away from the general election, a lot has transpired over these last many days that could reflect how things turn out on November 5th, 2024. Let's talk, George, about, well, was the debate on Wednesday night. A lot has happened when it comes to the presidential side of this.
I thought the debate was interesting, Kyle, but listen, yesterday we had the President of the United States turning himself in, but that really wasn't that big of a deal in my mind because it's the fourth time he's had to answer for an indictment, and what an amazing circumstance to find ourselves in 2023 that a president turning himself in on an indictment is routine. And that seems to be where we're at. I'm anxious to see if we're able to move past this. I'm not sure if it overshadowed the debate, but certainly his absence from the debate turned out to be quite a big deal as well. I was intrigued by the different candidates that made it on the stage and sort of how they responded to things. It's going to be a heck of an election cycle coming up.
I think the debate showed us a glimmer of what life would be like without Donald Trump. I think there was a field of competent candidates on the stage. I think we heard true conservative principles being, extolled. It was kind of nice to have a break from kind of the sniping and the remarks and the personal attacks. We did have a candidate kind of do that, try to upstage a young candidate. He's 38, Vivek Ramaswamy. I was very impressed with Nikki Haley, who honestly I'd kind of forgotten about her. She came out very strong. She pointed out the fact that he has no experience in foreign policy, and it was clearly showing. She later went on to talk about this situation with Trump, and she said, look, I'm not saying, I don't know if this is, a political attack on him with these legal dealings, or whether he's really guilty of these charges, but the fact of the matter is he's a huge distraction to this election. And perhaps the Republican Party would best be served by putting him aside and going with another candidate.
Alton, with your years of working in elections at the city of county of Denver, when you see another group of hopefuls, when you watch those things, what goes through your mind?
Anytime you have these debates with 6, 8, 10, 12 candidates on stage, I was having flashbacks to the Denver mayoral. It's hard to sort through all that off the top. I found Ramaswamy to be very interesting, but I also found some of the things that Chris Christie had to say to be very interesting, as far as what he did governing in a blue state. Now, locally, another thing that we're keeping an eye on, of course, is going to be the 3rd Congressional District, and see especially when it comes down to early polls. Anything 2% is well within the margin of error. So I think given how sprawling the third CD is, the battleground is actually going to be in Pueblo and bringing back some of those hardcore Union Democrats that had strayed over the past few election cycles.
While President Trump was not at the debate, this isn't the first time this has happened, that a frontrunner has chosen not to attend the debate. And really, I think this was President Trump signaling, I don't need to be there. You guys need to be there. So when we look at history, we've looked at Mitt Romney skipped the first debate of the 2012 cycle, George W. Bush skipped the first 3 debates in 2000, Bob Dole skipped the first debate in 1996, and Reagan didn't show up till the last debate before the 1980 Iowa caucus. And then we also know that Trump himself also opt out against attending the pre-Iowa debate. So there's a history of this occurring, and usually it is a front runner who's ahead in the polls, basically signaling that I'm confident in my lead, I don't need to be on the stage with you. But we're 439 days until Election Day. So I imagine as the field narrows, we'll sort of see a transition where the former president might put himself more front and center.
Adam is counting the days. Thank you for that history lesson. I kind of forgot all about that, about different candidates not coming to debates.
Yeah, yeah, it's fascinating.
You know, Kyle, I want to circle back to something Alton said. He talked about he cited the Keating Research report that came out, the survey, and it puts Adam Frisch ahead of Lauren Boebert by 2 points. The margin of error is 3.5. So essentially they're deadlocked. And I think this is significant. I know it's very early in the race. A lot can happen. Who knows what can happen? But we're talking about a district that is +8 Republican. It's a district also that in the poll, Donald Trump still beats Joe Biden by 5 points. And then also significant was her unfavorables were 53%. Additionally, she has a primary from a very reputable attorney on the Western Slope, Jeff Hurd. He is backed by some heavy hitters, former Senator Hank Brown, who has no reason to come off the bench and get involved in anything unless it means something to him, and also Tim Foster. Tim Foster is the former president of Colorado Mesa University, well known and well liked on the Western Slope. She's also having difficulty raising money comparative to Adam Frisch. You know, perhaps the Republicans want to go a different route and coalesce behind Hurd. I'm not sure. That might be an answer to them, but it's going to be a very interesting race in Congressional District 3. Get the popcorn.
Is there any room for further response on that? And again, in no way am I defending the status quo, but the poll was a Democrat, basically, internal poll, and they give you the best numbers they can come up with. And the best numbers they can come up with is within the margin of error. That's really unchanged from the outcome of the election in November. I mean, Lauren Boebert won by hundreds of votes. It sounds like nothing has changed. I think the other thing to remember, though, is that outcome took place when there were statewide candidates running for re-election, Senate, governor. None of that will take place now. That takes a lot of money out of the third CD. And the money that's going to show up isn't going to be Joe Biden's money. It might be Trump money to gin up the vote. I'm not sure that she's cold yet on this. Lauren Boebert could still pull this thing out. And by the way, Adam Frisch also has his own primary that he has to run as well from some credible candidates. So popcorn, yes.
Colorado presidential primary, by the way, is March 5th of next year. But first up, Coloradans will also be voting in November on Prop 8H, which, if passed, would reduce property taxes while also shrinking TABOR refunds. And there's a lot more to it. Chris, a lawsuit was filed by conservatives trying to make sure it did not get on the ballot, and the Colorado Supreme Court said, no, it's going to go on the ballot.
Yeah, that's unfortunate for Republicans. Still, I think that opponents to HH have a very strong argument. It's been really vetted on this show quite a bit. You do see more money coming in from proponents, however. So I think that if we see HH defeated, there is a real opportunity here, and I've talked to lawmakers about this. You know, why not call a special session? Get some thought leaders from the legislature together with the governor, and why not take the opportunity to revamp Colorado's tax system? The governor has played around with this idea of eliminating the income tax. Why not come out with a whole new tax system that is reliant on taxing consumptive use with some exemptions? Lower property taxes. I don't think you can do away with them entirely, and then eliminate the income tax. What could that do for Colorado's economy? It could be a legacy piece of legislation for both lawmakers and the governor. I think that could be an option worth pursuing.
Interesting. Okay. Alton.
I'm really going to be interested to hear George's take on this because it seems a little backwards to me. Where did we get in this sort of environment where it's like, okay, let's see if something passes first and then determine if it violates single subject? That's the same thing that's going on out in Aurora with their strong mayor thing. They're like, oh no, it's good to form and everything like that, and well, it's not single subject. Well, we have to put it on the ballot and see if it passes, and then we can revisit it. That seems totally backwards to me. And so, just keeping an eye on, like some things we've talked about on this era before, just how voters seem to be a little more tuned in, but the devil really seems to be in the details when it comes to this. And I know we're going to sort of touch on educational stuff later, but why don't we just keep it simple and fund education?
Which, Adam, they say a lot of the money would go to.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. So this is being prefaced by the administration and the proponents as a taxing measure. But when you really get into the weeds of what the measure actually is aiming to do, and our colleagues at Common Sense Institute here in Colorado ran an analysis of this, we're talking about potentially generating billions of dollars to backfill education, well above funding they would get otherwise without this initiative passing, well above the BS factor, which is sort of that stabilization factor we're looking at for schools. And so when you do the math, you're essentially saying we're going to take property taxes, we're going to lower them, we're going to keep Tabor rebates, and we're going to backfill budgets for local governments and school districts and some others. Local governments have a cap on sort of the backfill they can receive. Schools do not. Schools would get billions and billions of dollars from this proposal, assuming the economy's healthy and all goes well for the next decade. And it's surprising that voters aren't more aware of that. So if there's one thing I would tell voters, I'd say look into the education components of this bill. That's really where the meat of this measure is.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, to take up Alton's question, I agree. And what he's referring to there is Advanced Colorado filed a lawsuit saying, hey, whoa, this HH thing has at least 4 identifiable subjects. We have a constitutional requirement that a ballot issue have 1 subject on it. And the Supreme Court punted. And it said it almost Pelosi'd this thing. Well, you're going to have to vote for it before we find out how many subjects are in it. I think that makes it very precarious for proponents and, frankly, for voters. They may be throwing their vote away on something the Supreme Court may undo after the fact. I think the other thing to remember, though, is that while this is termed a decrease in property taxes, even if this thing passes, property taxes are going to go up by about 31%. You talked about in the beginning that this would shrink Tabor refunds. We're going to have to define shrink to be pretty broad to include the death of Tabor refunds, because if this thing passes, folks are going to lose over the next decade around $5,100 on average, and then they will never, ever again get another Tabor refund. Meanwhile, government can grow between now and 2040 by an extra $21 billion if this passes. So while I know the proponents want to say this is a tax cut and has a negative tax consequence, the Common Sense Institute study makes it pretty clear that it is more likely than not that individuals will pay more, property owners will pay more if this thing passes than if it doesn't.
Earlier this week, Governor Polis signed an executive order to slash the amount of time it takes for the state to pay affordable housing developers to get to work. And Alton, Polis also told state agencies that they need to get ready for the 1.72 million people who are projected to call Colorado home by 2050.
One of the things with this is, of course, keeping an eye on how our libertarian governor is going to tackle this, because as we've seen with like the early childhood thing, there's been a bit of a bumpy rollout. I'm seeing this almost as parallel to what Biden tried to do with the student loans. It got shot down at the court level, so it's like, okay, let's see what we can do, because we're not able to come up with the legislative fix that we tried to put through last go-round. Let's come up with a fail-safe. So it makes sense. Now, the thing to also remember is so goes the state. It sort of radiates out of Denver. Brother Jeff always refers to Denver as the mile-high income city, because you need a mile-high income to be able to live here. And then there was a time you could escape that by going to a bedroom community like Erie or Frederick or somewhere. Those days are over. We're becoming at risk of being like a boutique state where no one can afford to even live. And quick history lesson here. There was a time when people who worked for the city and county of Denver, there used to be a residency requirement. You had to live in Denver. And that's why we have places like Montbello, Green Valley Ranch, Grant Ranch, these places that are 20 miles from the city center, so people could have places to live like in the 70s and 80s. And I see that same thing coming again. We have to have somewhere for our teachers. We have to have somewhere for our law enforcement, somewhere where they can afford to live and work in their same community. So I think this is a good first step.
Adam.
I think it's interesting. So the executive order is basically a directive to different agencies within the government to expedite processes for these sort of 10 strategic growth objectives. One of the big ones that the governor talked about was expediting DOLA processes for executing contracts for developers to build housing from essentially 8 months to 90 days. And the governor was pressed on this at the press conference about, that sounds great. How are you going to do that? And I'll be honest, there weren't a ton of definitive answers. We know DOLA workers can't work more. They didn't talk about upping the staff. They simply talked about cutting processes and directing funding. So I think there's a lot of questions remaining on how this will affect. And I don't think we should get confused. This is just the start of another housing fight next session. Yes. And this is the governor laying the base to say the state is doing its part. Local governments, now it's your turn to put the pressure on them.
All right, George.
Yeah, I've heard this thing characterized in those terms. I've also heard it characterized as, hey, this is just virtue signaling. It's more than that. It is far more aggressive and ambitious than I think most people are giving it credit for, because what this is an attempt by the governor to use the state to force localities into bending to the will of the state in terms of housing priorities. And the way it does that is to say, I want every state agency that gives grant money or loans to localities or housing developments to now inventory how they do that. The next step will be for them to say, we're going to bootstrap that money to these different things. And these priorities include things like less infrastructure, minimizing the amount of time. One of the things that he says in this executive order is Coloradans want to live close to where they work. That's not true. I don't feel that way. No one in my community feels that way. That's why we live in Douglas County. I think at the end of the day, this is a first step towards an ambitious plan by a governor who wants to be perceived as libertarian to end up grabbing up more local control by doing what the federal government has been doing to us for years, which is to say, well, we can't legislate a 21-year-old age limit for alcohol, but if you don't do it, we withhold highway funds. This is the equivalent of that. If you want funding for your housing project, you will do it the way we tell you to do it.
The fact that the governor repeated over and over and over, this state is going to lead by example. When you make that statement, it's because you expect people to fall behind you. If you're going to lead, you want people to fall in line. It was funny to see the GOP come out and say, why is it the governor has to issue an executive order to get people to do their jobs? So that was also another criticism. The Colorado Municipal League was highly, a very vocal opponent to what was SB 23-213, which was the land use bill. It was basically the state telling local municipalities how to do their zoning. I would anticipate that as this legislative session takes up and goes into a lot of the things, they will again be a vocal opponent to things that they disagree with. Their big mantra is participation, not preemption. So we'll see how it goes.
Okay. Just as we kick off a new school year, the standardized test scores are out showing how Colorado students are doing academically. And there are some bright lights, but we're still seeing that our kids are dealing with the effects of disrupted learning during the pandemic. And Adam, achievement gaps remain.
Yeah, I think if anything, we learned from the CMAS results that the damage inflicted by the pandemic continues. So a few data points. So Asian students outperformed white students on 11 of the 12 tests. The white-black achievement gap ran between 24 to 31 points, depending on the subject. The white-Hispanic gap was about the same. And the gap between students who qualify for federal free and reduced price lunch and their wealthier peers is actually even higher than that, 27 to 35 points. What this shows us, and I want to be very clear here, those gaps are not new. Those are gaps that existed pre-pandemic. If anything, it shows us how much work we have to do to address these gaps, even more now as we come out of the pandemic. So it'll be very interesting with Denver Public School Board election November. Many other schools across the state also going to have conversations about what do these test results mean and how do we get to shorten these gaps between students.
One of the statistics that Adam didn't cite that is important is girls suffered more under, and I want to clarify this, it wasn't the pandemic, it was government's response to the pandemic. Not every state shut their schools down the way Colorado did, and whether you agree or disagree with that, we have the ability to compare to performance in Florida and other states that took a different approach. So it wasn't the pandemic, it was the government's response to the pandemic. But girls in the state of Colorado seem to have suffered more in terms of their loss of the gap they had over boys, and that's bothersome. For the father of a daughter who still plans on taking over the planet Earth, the idea of whatever we went through causing them a tougher, steeper hill to climb, even in this economy and in this society, is really troubling. I don't know what the way out is. I just know that this tells us that in the future, if we have something else like this pandemic, our response better be more nuanced, it better be more forward-thinking, because this did not work out for us.
It's true, achievement gaps have always been there and that they have grown worse. One district, though, I think it really highlights DPS. DPS historically has beaten the state average in all demographics. Under Michael Bennett, they had their best days in that district. We have taken our eye off achievement, and I think that's happened particularly in DPS. We see it in the scores. Once we get our eyes back on that and focus on it, maybe we'll see better scores.
And I know, Alton, you're always looking at DPS.
I'm always looking at DPS as a DPS grad, and there's a few factors here. One, we have a school board that essentially is neutered. Every time someone asks them something about what role did you play in this principal's termination, what role did you play in getting the taste of the South shut down at George Washington High School? Well, that wasn't us, that was such and such. Okay, what's the superintendent doing on A, B, and C? We don't know. And it's like, well, wait a minute, he reports to y'all. But one of the things with the racial achievement gap, Denver Public Schools is predominantly students of color now. And so, to Chris's point, until we get back on focusing on the core outcome of the mission, it's called the Board of Education. Educate our children.
All right, now it is a point in the show where we go through some highs and lows of the week, either here in Colorado or somewhere else. And George, who's sitting in for Patty this week, and the first chair is going to start us off with something that really disappointed you, angered you, bothered you this week.
It's unresolved, but what bothers me is that we are now 4 years removed from the unnecessary and tragic death of Elijah McClain, and we still are dealing with a court case that has yet to be brought to trial. It's going to happen next month, and we're still seeing changes in the charges even 4 years later. My great concern is there's going to be another delay, and I'm telling you, it's not good for the community. It's certainly not good for Elijah McClain's family, and it's not good for justice.
I attended a press event and it went longer than I anticipated. I came out to a parking ticket, which is understandable. I didn't feed the meter. However, I came out to an additional ticket, a $100 ticket for not having a license plate on the front of my truck, which I still have the plate, I just have not affixed. But the insult to injury in this situation was I was parked on the very same street in Denver at the very same time of day that 4 months prior, my truck was broken into. And I could not get a police officer to come out and take a report. I had to file online. This is really disappointing to me. It gives me the opinion that the city of Denver is more concerned about revenue than it is about reducing crime.
Mine sort of dovetails on that around the uptick in criminality that we're dealing with. You know, for the second time, actually the third time, somebody who has been doing great work in the community has lost the son to gun violence. And it just makes no sense. And so there are certain things that as a society, and I don't care what color you are, where you grew up, whether you had a dad or not, this thing where we just default to gunplay to solve all of our problems, I think we are at a societal tipping point that if we don't get our hands back around our kids in some form or fashion, we're in big trouble.
Adam.
Similarly, so 11 blocks from here earlier this week, there was a shooting at one of the homeless encampments here in Denver. They are doing a sweep today as a response, and the administration's receiving a lot of pushback for sort of the quick timeline. Just a reminder of we are certainly not out of the woods, even with a new mayor, with a lot of work left to do.
All right, something positive, George.
Great thing was everyone's back to school. I took my son, Trey, up to CSU. And even though I'm a Buff, go Buffs twice, I'm going to wear the green and the gold because this kid is excited for school and the first time since the pandemic. And I want to feed that passion. And thank you, Fort Collins, for being so open and welcoming.
That's great to hear.
Yeah.
That's a great tone. Mine is kind of fun. I missed last week's show and I wanted to see it, so I Googled Colorado Inside Out and pulled up my whole web page. Of course, you go to the first one to find the link, but I found out that Colorado Inside Out is seen in Austin, Texas. Whoa. It's seen in California. It's seen in Wisconsin. And I'm really curious about what the other states, why they have an interest in Colorado politics. So if anybody's out there and they want to email the show, I'd be really curious to hear what they like watching.
That would be awesome. All right, Alton.
And me, of course, I'm nerding out on live music opportunities again. There's a thing called Jet Set Jams, which takes place at the airport on the Quad by the Westin, and it's Becky Taylor and Sandra Watts have been putting on a music series out there, and because we're in the middle of a live free RTD month, I've been hopping on the A line and just going out there and catching some great music. And plus, I also get a chance in the next week and a half to go see a show at the new Dazzle. So I am in heaven right now.
Oh, that's good. Good for you. All right, sir.
Yeah, mine is actually the August recess. So Congress is out. We have seen our members all over their districts these last couple weeks, meeting with constituents, and I think that's where democracy sort of comes to life, right, is when we get these members in D.C. back. Something of interesting was the top Democrat in the House, Hakeem Jeffries, made the rounds with our members this past couple weeks, which tells me Colorado is still viewed as competitive. You can see that the congressional Dems are making an effort to sort of try and lock down Colorado, but you can expect a lot of attention as we head into the next election here in the Denver metro and beyond. So.
Okay, all right. And my positive is our friend and our super smart colleague, Adam Burg, is starting a big, brand new job after Labor Day. Adam was tapped by Denver Mayor Mike Johnson to be the Federal and State Affairs Director for the city. That job is all about maintaining relationships and advocating for Denver's policy goals and resource needs, not only here at the state capitol, but also in D.C. So thank you. I can't think of a better guy to be more engaged and get people excited about what we need to make Denver and Colorado great. So thank you very much, Adam. We wish you all the best. Thanks to our entire panel for coming this week, and for you all who are tuning in, watching from home or on your device, or listening on our podcast. I am Kyle Dyer, and I will see you next week here on PBS 12.